The sound of a hammer striking wood echoed through the dusty streets of Rico, Colorado, in the spring of 1878. But Margaret Taylor could barely hear it over the pounding of her own heart. Her hands were bound with coarse rope that bit into her wrists, and the auction pen little more than a crude wooden platform surrounded by eager-faced men felt like a gallows. She had never imagined finding herself here, being sold like cattle after the stagecoach attack that had left her the sole survivor. Margaret's honey-brown hair hung limply around her face, partially hiding the bruise on her cheek. Her once fine blue traveling dress was torn and stained with the red Colorado dust. 3 days ago, she had been traveling west to start a new life as a schoolteacher. Now she was property. Next up, a fine young woman, educated from back east, should fetch a good price for domestic work, or whatever else you gentlemen might fancy. The auctioneer called out with a yellow-toothed grin that made Margaret's stomach turn. The crowd of men laughed, a harsh sound that sent tremors through her body. Margaret had heard rumors of these illegal auctions in remote mining towns, where lawlessness prevailed and human dignity was worth less than gold dust. She closed her eyes, trying to stop the shaking that had overtaken her body. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer announced. "50. Called a voice from the back. "60, shouted another. Margaret kept her eyes shut, unable to look at the faces of the men bidding for her life. The voices grew louder, the prices higher. 75, 85, 100. She prayed for deliverance that seemed impossible in this godless corner of the frontier. The bidding reached $120 when a new voice cut through the crowd, steady, authoritative, yet somehow gentle. $300. A hush fell over the gathering. Margaret's eyes flew open, searching for the source of the voice. At the edge of the crowd stood a tall man, his face partially obscured by the brim of a worn leather hat. He wore a dark coat over a simple shirt, and unlike the miners and drifters that populated the auction, his stance spoke of purpose and dignity. 300, the auctioneer repeated, shock evident in his voice. "That's more than generous for did I stutter?" The stranger asked, his voice hard as iron now. The auctioneer swallowed. 300 going once, twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. As the crowd dispersed, grumbling about the unexpected conclusion to the auction, the stranger approached the platform. Margaret stiffened, unsure if this fate would be any better than the others that had awaited her. The man climbed the steps, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden planks. He moved closer, and Margaret could finally see his face clearly, sun-weathered and serious, with eyes the color of a summer sky. Not much older than 30, she guessed, with a quiet strength in his expression that made her breath catch. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, his voice meant only for her as he drew a knife from his belt. Margaret flinched, but instead of harming her, he carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. As the rough fibers fell away, he leaned in closer. "My name is Yates Lawson," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm here to take you home." Margaret blinked, confusion washing over her. "Home," she managed, her voice cracking from disuse. "Somewhere safe," he clarified, draping his coat around her shoulders. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs felt as unsteady as a newborn colt's. Yates placed a supportive hand beneath her elbow as they descended the steps. The auctioneer approached, hand extended for payment. Yates passed him the money without a word, his expression making it clear that conversation was unwelcome. They walked through town, past the curious stares of Rico's inhabitants. Margaret kept her head down, shame burning her cheeks despite knowing none of this was her fault. Yates guided her toward a sturdy bay horse tethered outside the general store. "We'll need supplies before we head out," he explained, his voice low. Do you need anything specific? Medicine? Food? Margaret hesitated, overwhelmed by his unexpected kindness. Water, she whispered. And perhaps something clean to wear. Yates nodded. Wait here with Thunder. I'll be quick. True to his word, he returned minutes later with a canvas bag of supplies. He helped Margaret onto the horse before mounting behind her, his arms creating a secure circle as he took the reins. It's about 3 hours to my place, he said as they rode out of town. Can you manage that? I have little choice, Margaret replied, tension still evident in every line of her body. You always have a choice, Miss Taylor. Margaret Taylor, she supplied, realizing she hadn't even introduced herself. Miss Taylor, I give you my word as a man who values such things that I mean you no harm. I have a small ranch outside of town with a separate cabin where you can stay until you decide what you want to do. You're not my property, regardless of what transaction just took place back there. Margaret remained silent, processing his words. After several minutes of riding through the rugged Colorado landscape, she finally spoke. Why did you do it? Why spend so much money on a stranger? Yates was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally did, his voice was soft but clear against the mountain breeze. Because 5 years ago, my sister was taken in a raid. No one helped her. I couldn't save her then, but I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else. Not when I could do something about it. His honesty struck Margaret deeply. She had heard many false words from men before, but something about Yates Lawson's straightforward explanation rang with truth. Gradually, the rigid tension in her shoulders began to ease, though she remained cautious. As promised, after 3 hours of riding through rolling hills and pine forests, they approached a modest ranch nestled in a valley. A small main house built of logs and stone stood flanked by a barn, corral, and the separate cabin Yates had mentioned. It wasn't grand, but in the late afternoon light, with smoke curling from the chimney, it looked like salvation. A young man of perhaps 19 emerged from the barn as they approached. Mr. Lawson was beginning to wonder if you'd make it back before dark. Had an unexpected detour, Daniel, Yates replied, dismounting before carefully helping Margaret down. This is Miss Taylor. She'll be staying in the visitor's cabin for a while. Daniel's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Margaret's disheveled appearance, but to his credit, he simply nodded. I'll see to your horse, sir. Thank you. And Daniel, not a word to anyone in town, the young man finished with a knowing nod. Yes, sir. Yates led Margaret to the cabin, a simple but clean structure with a main room containing a bed, table, and stove, and a small adjoining washroom. It's not much, he said, setting down her supplies, but you'll have privacy here. It's more than I expected to have today, Margaret replied honestly. Mr. Lawson, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, he said simply. There's water heating on the stove. I'll have Daniel bring over some supper in about an hour, but until then, you can rest and get cleaned up. He pointed to the bag of supplies. There's a dress in there, bought it from the general store. Might not fit perfectly, but it should do for now. Margaret nodded, tears threatening to spill over. Thank you. Yates tipped his hat. I'll leave you be, Miss Taylor. Lock the door behind me. No one will disturb you without your permission. After he left, Margaret did as instructed, then leaned against the door, finally allowing the tears to come. She cried for the terror she'd experienced, for the uncertain future ahead, and strangely, for the unexpected kindness of a man who had no reason to show it. Later, bathed and dressed in the simple but clean cotton dress Yates had purchased, Margaret felt more human than she had in days. A knock at the door announced Daniel with a tray of food, beef stew, biscuits, and hot coffee. Mr. Lawson thought you might prefer to eat alone tonight, madam, Daniel explained, setting the tray on the table. "That's very considerate," Margaret replied, hunger overtaking her hesitation as the aroma of the stew reached her. "He's a good man, Mr. Lawson," Daniel said earnestly. "Best I've ever worked for. Whatever brought you here? You're safe now." After Daniel left, Margaret ate ravenously, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal since before the stagecoach attack. As she finished the last of her coffee, she looked around the small cabin that was now her sanctuary and wondered what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope that it might bring something good. Morning arrived with soft golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Margaret woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up, wincing at her sore muscles, legacy of days spent bound and uncomfortable. A gentle knock at the door startled her. "Miss Taylor," Yates's voice called, "there's breakfast at the main house when you're ready. No rush." Margaret dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, wishing she had something more presentable. She combed her fingers through her hair, attempting to tame the waves before stepping outside. The morning was glorious, cool mountain air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of spring. The ranch looked even more appealing in daylight, with wildflowers dotting the nearby meadow and the mountains rising majestically in the distance. Margaret took a moment to simply breathe, appreciating freedom in a way she never had before. Yates was waiting on the porch of the main house, whittling a piece of wood. He stood as she approached, setting aside his project. "Good morning. Hope you slept well." "Better than I expected to," she admitted. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Lawson." "Yates, please," he said, opening the door for her. "Only the hands call me Mr. Lawson, and even that feels strange sometimes." The interior of the main house was modest but comfortable, with hand-hewn furniture and simple decorations. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, making Margaret's stomach rumble embarrassingly. "Sit, please," Yates gestured to the table. "Coffee?" "Yes, thank you." He poured her a cup, then brought over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "I'm not much of a cook, but I manage the basics." They ate in silence for a few minutes before Yates spoke again. "I need to ask what happened to you, Miss Taylor. Not to pry, but to know if there's anyone we need to be concerned about coming after you." Margaret set down her fork, the memory stealing her appetite. "I was traveling on the Durango stagecoach. I had accepted a position as the schoolteacher in a town called Silverton. We were attacked by bandits about 2 days' ride from here." She swallowed hard. "The driver and the other passengers, a couple returning from Denver, were killed. I think the bandits only spared me because... You don't need to explain," Yates said gently. "What happened next? They took me to a camp. There were other men there. They argued about what to do with me. Eventually, they decided to sell me in Rico, where they said the law wouldn't interfere." She met his eyes. "They were right about that, weren't they? The sheriff did nothing." Yates's jaw tightened. "Sheriff Kelly owns the saloon and takes a percentage from those auctions. He's the law in name only. And you? Do you make a habit of rescuing women from such situations?" "No," he admitted. "This is the first time I've interfered. Usually I hear about these auctions after the fact." He hesitated. "I was in town for supplies when I overheard talk about an educated lady being sold today. I couldn't just ride away." Margaret studied him, searching for any hint of deception. "What do you expect in return?" "Nothing," he said firmly. "When you're recovered, I'll take you wherever you want to go. Silverton, if you still want that teaching position, or back east if you prefer. And in the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. Rest, recover. The ranch is isolated enough that those bandits won't find you, even if they come looking." Margaret took a sip of coffee, considering her options. "I have no money. Everything I owned was in my trunk on the stagecoach." "That's not your concern right now," Yates replied. "I'm not a wealthy man, Miss Taylor, but I have enough." "I can't accept charity indefinitely," she said, her pride asserting itself despite her circumstances. A slight smile crossed Yates's face. "Fair enough. If you're feeling up to it, there's plenty of work to be done around here. Daniel helps with the cattle and horses, but I've no one to tend the garden or help with the household." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'd be glad to earn my keep, at least until I decide what to do next." "Good." Yates stood, collecting their empty plates. "Today, rest. Tomorrow, we can figure out the rest." As he turned to wash the dishes, Margaret studied him surreptitiously. In the morning light, she could see he was handsome in a rugged way, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. His dark blonde hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and when he glanced back at her, those striking blue eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his frontier-hardened exterior. "Is there something else you need?" he asked, catching her gaze. Margaret shook her head, embarrassed to be caught staring. "I was just wondering about your ranch. How long have you been here?" "Almost 3 years now," he replied, seeming relieved by the mundane question. "Came out from Texas after my time with the Rangers. Wanted somewhere quieter." "The Rangers? You were a lawman," a shadow passed over his features. "For a time, after my sister. I thought enforcing the law might help make sense of things. It didn't." Margaret sensed there was more to that story but respected his reticence. "And now you raise cattle." "Mostly horses, actually. I break and train them for ranchers and the army. The cattle are just for our use and to sell locally." He dried his hands on a towel. "I need to check on a mare that's close to foaling. Make yourself at home. There are books in the sitting room if you'd like to read." After Yates left, Margaret explored the house, curious about the man who had rescued her. The sitting room contained a surprising number of books, classics, history, even poetry. A framed photograph on the mantel caught her attention. A younger Yates standing beside a pretty young woman with the same blue eyes. His sister, Margaret guessed. Feeling a pang of sympathy, on impulse, Margaret decided to make herself useful rather than rest. She found cleaning supplies in a pantry and set about tidying the already neat house. The physical activity helped keep her mind from dwelling on her ordeal, and by midday the floors were swept, surfaces dusted, and windows gleaming. She was preparing coffee when Yates returned, looking surprised to find her at his stove. "You didn't need to do that," he said, glancing around at the freshly cleaned kitchen. "I wanted to," Margaret replied. "Idleness only leads to thinking, and I'd rather not think too much right now." Understanding crossed his face. "Fair enough. The foal arrived healthy colt with good lines. Would you like to see him after we have coffee?" The invitation surprised her. "I'd like that very much." They walked together to the barn, maintaining a respectful distance that nonetheless felt comfortable. Inside, a beautiful chestnut mare stood protectively over a wobbly-legged foal with a white star on its forehead. "He's beautiful," Margaret breathed, staying back to avoid disturbing the new mother. "He'll make a fine saddle horse someday," Yates agreed, his usual reserve softening as he watched the animals. "I've always found horses to be better company than most people, more honest." "Your ranch is lovely," Margaret said sincerely. "You've built something special here." "It's a work in progress," he replied, but she could see her words pleased him. Like most worthwhile things, they stood in companionable silence, watching the new life find its legs. Margaret felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over her. Yesterday, she had been facing a fate worse than death. Today, she was watching a foal take its first steps beside a man who asked nothing of her, but seemed to offer everything she needed: safety, respect, and time to heal. Perhaps Yates was right. Sometimes, The most worthwhile things were works in progress, including, she thought, the rebuilding of her own shattered sense of security. The next 2 weeks established a routine that brought Margaret increasing comfort. She took over management of the household, cooking meals that far surpassed Yates's basic fare and transforming the functional ranch house with small touches: wildflowers in jars, curtains fashioned from spare fabric, shelves reorganized for convenience. Yates had purchased clothing and necessities for her on his next trip to town, brushing off her protests about the expense. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he'd said, though they both knew the items cost more than any fair compensation for her household work. They settled into a rhythm of shared meals and increasingly comfortable conversation. Margaret learned that Yates had grown up on a struggling Texas farm, that he'd joined the Rangers after his sister's abduction by raiders, and that he'd come to Colorado seeking peace after years of violence had left him hollow. In turn, she shared her own story: her childhood in Boston, losing her parents to influenza when she was 18, and her decision to accept a teaching position out west rather than marry the much older businessman her uncle had selected for her. "You're braver than most," Yates remarked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "Coming out here alone, or more foolish," Margaret replied with a wry smile, "given how quickly my adventure nearly ended in disaster." "The brave and the foolish often walk the same path," Yates said. "The difference is that the brave keep walking even after they've seen the dangers." Margaret considered this. "By that definition, I'm not sure which I am yet. I haven't decided if I'll continue to Silverton." Yates was quiet for a moment. "The position may still be open. I could inquire when I'm next in town." "Thank you," she said, though the prospect of leaving the safety of the ranch caused anxiety to flutter in her chest. "I should decide soon. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's no imposition," Yates said, his voice softer than usual. "The ranch hasn't felt this much like a home since, well, ever, if I'm being honest." Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, suddenly conscious of something unspoken growing between them. Margaret felt color rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the dimming light. "I should check on that bread," she said, rising quickly. "And I have some ledgers to review," Yates agreed, standing as well. They moved in opposite directions, each aware that something had shifted, like the imperceptible change in air pressure before a storm. The next morning, Yates announced he needed to ride into Rico for supplies and to check on a horse he was training for a local rancher. "Would you like to come along?" he asked over breakfast. "Mighty you good to get off the ranch for a bit." Margaret hesitated. The thought of returning to the town where she'd nearly been sold terrified her, but she recognized that she couldn't hide forever. "Will it be safe?" "You'll be with me," Yates said simply, as if that answered everything. And strangely it did. They rode into town side by side, Margaret now comfortable on a gentle mare Yates had chosen for her. She wore a proper riding skirt and blouse, her hair neatly braided, looking nothing like the disheveled captive she'd been 2 weeks earlier. Still, as they approached the outskirts of Rico, her hands tightened on the reins. "We don't have to do this today," Yates offered, noticing her tension. Margaret straightened her spine. "No, I need to face this. I won't live in fear." Yates nodded, respect evident in his expression. "We'll start at the Mercantile, then visit the telegraph office. I can inquire about the Silverton position while you shop." Rico appeared different in the bright morning light, less threatening, more mundane. Still, Margaret stayed close to Yates as they tied their horses outside the Mercantile. Inside, the shopkeeper greeted Yates warmly. "Mr. Lawson, good to see you." "And the lady as well," he added, eyeing Margaret curiously. Miss Taylor is helping manage my household, Yates explained smoothly, offering no further details. We need flour, coffee, sugar, and whatever else is on this list. As Yates conducted business, Margaret explored the store, selecting thread, buttons, and fabric to make curtains for her cabin. She was examining a bolt of blue cotton when she sensed someone behind her. "Well now, ain't you cleaned up pretty?" She turned to find a rough-looking man with tobacco-stained teeth leering at her. It took only seconds to recognize him, one of the men who had bid on her at the auction. "Thought I recognized you," he continued, stepping closer. "Lawson's been keeping you all to himself, has he? Mighty selfish, considering what he paid." Margaret's throat closed with fear, but before she could respond, Yates appeared at her side. "Problem here, Barton?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Just making conversation with the lady," Barton replied, not backing down. "Curious what makes her worth $300. Margaret felt Yates tense beside her, saw his hand move slightly toward the gun at his hip. "Miss Taylor is under my protection," he said quietly. "That's all you need to know." "Protection?" Barton snorted. "That what they're calling it these days?" In one swift motion, Yates had Barton pinned against a shelf, forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Choose your next words very carefully," he warned, voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Taylor is a lady deserving of respect, and you will address her as such, or you won't address her at all. Are we clear?" Barton's eyes bulged as he nodded frantically. Yates released him, and the man stumbled away, gasping. "You'll regret that, Lawson," he wheezed. "I doubt it," Yates replied evenly. He turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "Can we leave now? Just need to pay for our items," he assured her, guiding her to the counter with a gentle hand at the small of her back. Outside, as they loaded their purchases onto the horses, Margaret finally found her voice. "I'm sorry about that." "You have nothing to apologize for," Yates said firmly. "I've complicated your life. That man, Barton, is a drunk and a bully. No one in town takes him seriously." Yates secured the last bag, then turned to face her. "Margaret, look at me." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it startled her into meeting his gaze. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said, his blue eyes intense. "Nothing. What happened to you was not your fault, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The ferocity of his protection both moved and unsettled her. "You can't fight the entire town if they believe we're." "I don't care what they think," Yates said simply. "But if it concerns you, we can put the rumors to rest." "How?" A slight smile crossed his face. "For starters, we're going to walk into that telegraph office together, and I'm going to inquire about a teaching position in Silverton for the highly qualified Miss Taylor." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for his understanding. "Thank you." At the telegraph office, Yates sent 2 messages, one to the Silverton Town Council inquiring about the teaching position, and another to the territorial marshal about the stagecoach attack. They were told responses would likely come within a day or two. Their final stop was the small restaurant near the edge of town, where Yates insisted they have lunch before the ride home. Inside, several patrons glanced their way, but Yates's imposing presence deterred any comments. They were nearly finished with their meal when the door opened and a badge-wearing man entered. "That's Sheriff Kelly," Yates muttered, his expression darkening. "Best we leave now." Too late, the sheriff had spotted them and was making his way to their table. "Lawson," he greeted, tipping his hat. "And the lady from the auction, interesting." Margaret stiffened, but Yates spoke before she could. "Sheriff, Miss Taylor and I were just leaving." "Not in any trouble, are you, miss?" Kelly asked, his concern so obviously feigned that Margaret nearly laughed. "No, Sheriff," she replied coolly. Mr. Lawson has been a perfect gentleman. Has he now? The sheriff's gaze moved between them speculatively. That auction was legal business, Lawson. You bought her fair and square. What you do with her is your affair. Miss Taylor is not property, Yates replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's a lady who was kidnapped and illegally sold, which you well know. I've telegraphed the territorial marshal about the incident. The sheriff's face hardened. Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong could be unhealthy, Lawson. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Yates stood, his height giving him an advantage over the shorter lawman. Just friendly advice, Kelly replied, backing down slightly. Enjoy your day. As the sheriff walked away, Margaret noticed how pale Yates had become beneath his tan. Are you all right? She asked. Fine, he replied tersely. Let's go home. They rode in silence for the first hour, Yates lost in thought and Margaret unwilling to disturb him. Finally, as they crossed a stream that marked the halfway point to the ranch, Yates spoke. I'm sorry you had to face all that today, he said. I shouldn't have suggested the trip. No, I'm glad we went, Margaret replied honestly. Hiding would only give those men power over me. Yates looked at her with new respect. You're stronger than you look, Margaret Taylor. I'm learning to be, she said softly. I have a good teacher. Something changed in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but he simply nodded and urged his horse forward. That evening, after a quiet supper, they sat before the fireplace, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. Margaret worked on hemming the fabric she'd purchased for curtains while Yates read a book of poetry, occasionally reading passages aloud that he thought might interest her. May I ask you something personal? Margaret ventured during a lull. Yates closed his book. You can ask. I might not answer. Fair enough, she acknowledged. Today, with the sheriff, you seemed more affected than I would have expected. Is there history between you? Yates was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he'd decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from years away. Kelly reminds me of another corrupt lawman I encountered in my ranger days, a man who took bribes to look the other way when certain crimes were committed. He stared into the fire. My sister Emily was taken from our farm while I was away. By the time I tracked down the men responsible, it was too late. Margaret's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Yates. The local sheriff knew who had taken her, knew where they were. He did nothing because they paid him well. Yates's hands tightened on the book. I found out later that he'd been allowing such things to happen for years. Young women disappearing, never to be seen again. What did you do? What any brother would do, he replied grimly. I hunted down every last man involved. But it didn't bring Emily back, and it didn't wash the blood from my hands. Margaret set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. Tentatively, she placed her hand over his. You did what you believed was right. Did I? He asked, finally looking at her. Or did I just become another kind of monster? You're not a monster, Yates, Margaret said firmly. A monster wouldn't have saved me, wouldn't care for his animals so tenderly, wouldn't read poetry by firelight. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You have a charitable view of me. I have an honest view, she corrected. I've met monsters, Yates Lawson. You're nothing like them. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they both looked away, the intensity of the moment too much to sustain. It's getting late, Yates said, rising. I'll walk you to your cabin. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. They walked in silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. At the cabin door, Margaret turned to face him. Thank you for telling me about Emily, she said softly, and for everything else. Yates nodded, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Yates." As she closed the door, Margaret leaned against it, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Something was growing between them, something fragile and unexpected that both thrilled and terrified her. After everything she'd been through, she had never imagined feeling this way again, especially not so soon, and especially not for the man who had saved her. But as she prepared for bed, Margaret couldn't deny that Yates Lawson had become more than a rescuer or a temporary employer. He had become someone she looked forward to seeing each morning, someone whose smile made her day brighter, whose pain she felt as her own. She had come west seeking a new beginning. Perhaps she had found one, just not in the way she'd expected. The next morning, they fell back into their routine as if the previous day's revelations had never occurred. Yates worked with the horses while Margaret tended the garden and prepared meals. Only occasionally did their eyes meet and linger a moment too long, betraying the undercurrent that now ran between them. 3 days later, Daniel returned from town with telegrams for both of them. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened hers. "The teaching position is still available," she announced, looking up to find Yates watching her intently. "They ask if I can arrive within the month." Yates nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good news." "And yours?" she asked, nodding toward the paper in his hand. "The territorial marshal is sending men to investigate the stagecoach attack. They'll be in Rico next week and would like to interview you about what happened." Margaret swallowed hard. "Will you come with me?" "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "You don't have to face this alone." Their eyes met, and this time, neither looked away. Something had been decided in that exchange, though neither was ready to name it. The week passed quickly, filled with the usual ranch work and preparations for Margaret's testimony. Yates spent hours helping her recall details that might assist the marshal's men in identifying the attackers, while also assuring her that she needn't relive the worst parts of her ordeal. The night before they were to ride into Rico, Margaret couldn't sleep. After tossing and turning for hours, she gave up, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stepped outside. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead. She sat on the small bench outside her cabin, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. Couldn't sleep either. She started at Yates's voice, turning to see him approaching from the main house, a lantern in hand. "No," she admitted. "Tomorrow has me on edge." He set the lantern down and took a seat beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. "You'll do fine. Just tell them what you remember and let the lawmen do their job." "It's not just the testimony," Margaret confessed. "It's everything, Silverton, moving on, starting over again." Yates was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to go," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "To Silverton, I mean." Margaret's heart quickened. "What are you saying, Yates?" He turned to face her, his features half illuminated by the lantern's glow. "I'm saying that in the short time you've been here, this place has changed, or maybe I have. Either way, I find myself dreading the day you leave." "Yates, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's too soon. You've barely had time to recover from your ordeal, and the last thing you need is another complication. But I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that I've come to care for you, Margaret, more than I thought possible." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "I've come to care for you too," she whispered. "You have." The surprise in his voice made her smile despite her nervousness. "Is that so hard to believe? You saved my life, Yates. But more than that, you've shown me kindness and respect when I needed it most. You've made me feel safe again." "I would never want you to feel obligated. It's not obligation," she interrupted firmly. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who you are." In the silence that followed, Margaret could hear the soft hooting of an owl in the distance, and the quickened pace of her own breathing. Yates moved closer slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw. "Margaret," he murmured, his hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "May I kiss you?" The question, so respectful and unlike what most men would have presumed, made her heart swell. "Yes," she breathed. His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, a kiss that asked for nothing and promised everything. Margaret's hands came up to rest on his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly. "I've wanted to do that since the day you started putting wildflowers on my breakfast table," Yates admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Margaret laughed softly. "And I've wanted you to since the day I caught you reading Tennyson when you thought no one was looking." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "So where does this leave us?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I still need to testify tomorrow, and there's the matter of Silverton." "One day at a time," Yates suggested. "Let's get through tomorrow first." Margaret nodded, suddenly yawning despite herself. The emotional revelation had drained the last of her energy. "I should try to sleep." Yates stood, helping her to her feet. "Rest well, Margaret. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." He walked her to her door, pressing one more gentle kiss to her forehead before bidding her good night. As Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, she realized that for the first time in weeks, her dreams were not haunted by fear, but filled with hope. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect Colorado spring day that belied the tension Margaret felt as they prepared to ride into Rico. Yates was solicitous but not hovering, understanding her need to gather her strength. "The marshal's deputies will likely have questions about specific details," he explained as they rode. "Just answer truthfully, and don't be afraid to say if you don't remember something clearly." Margaret nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "I want these men caught, Yates. Not just for what they did to me, but for the others they killed." "The marshal's men are good at what they do," Yates assured her. "Your testimony will help ensure justice is served." When they reached Rico, they headed directly to the hotel where the deputies had arranged to take statements. Two stern-faced men introduced themselves as Deputy Marshals Fletcher and Harris. They conducted the interview professionally, asking detailed questions about the bandits' appearances, weapons, and anything they had said that might identify them. "These men match the description of a gang that's been attacking stagecoaches between Durango and Silverton for months," Fletcher explained when they had finished. "Your information confirms what we suspected." "Will you be able to find them?" Margaret asked. "We have a good idea where they're hiding," Harris replied. "Your testimony gives us enough to move on their camp." As they prepared to leave, Fletcher stopped Yates. "Lawson, Sheriff Kelly mentioned you paid a hefty sum for Miss Taylor at an auction. Care to explain that?" Margaret tensed, but Yates remained calm. "I believe that's irrelevant to your investigation, Deputy, unless you're also looking into illegal slave auctions in Rico." The deputies exchanged glances. "Not our jurisdiction at the moment," Fletcher said carefully. "But it might be of interest to know that Kelly's been under investigation for some time. Information about such activities would be useful. Then perhaps you should speak with the sheriff about his profitable sideline," Yates suggested. "Miss Taylor has been through enough without revisiting that particular ordeal." Fletcher nodded slowly. "Understood. Thank you both for your cooperation." Outside, Margaret released a shaky breath. "I didn't expect them to know about the auction." "Kelly's trying to shift attention away from himself," Yates explained as they walked toward their horses. "But it seems the marshal's office already has him in their sights." They were nearly to the livery when a voice called out, stopping them cold. "Well, if it ain't the schoolteacher and her pet cowboy." Margaret froze, instantly recognizing the voice of one of her captors. Slowly, she turned to see a bearded man leaning against a building, a sneer distorting his features. "Get behind me," Yates muttered, pushing Margaret slightly back as he faced the man. "You're making a mistake, friend." "Ain't your friend," the man growled, straightening. "And my only mistake was letting Barton convince me to sell this one instead of keeping her." His eyes slid to Margaret, who fought the urge to shrink away. "Didn't get my fair share of that 300 neither." "Walk away," Yates warned, his hand hovering near his gun. "Right now." "Or what?" The man took a step forward. "You gonna shoot me in broad daylight, Lawson? That badge you used to wear don't mean nothing now." Margaret glanced at Yates, surprised by this reference to his past, but his expression remained impassive. "Last warning," Yates said quietly. The man laughed, then reached for his own weapon with surprising speed. But Yates was faster. His gun was drawn and fired before the bandit could clear his holster. The shot echoed through the street, followed by shouts as people scattered for cover. The bandit crumpled, clutching his shoulder. "You shot me, you bastard." "Be grateful I aimed for your shoulder," Yates replied coldly, keeping his gun trained on the man as he kicked away the fallen weapon. "Margaret, run to the hotel. Get the deputies." She hesitated only a moment before gathering her skirts and racing back toward the hotel. Minutes later, she returned with Fletcher and Harris, who quickly took control of the situation. "This is Miles Deaver," Fletcher announced after searching the wounded man. "Wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder." "He's one of the men who attacked the stagecoach," Margaret confirmed, staying well back from her former captor. "He was at the camp where they held me." Harris nodded grimly. "We'll take it from here, Lawson. Good shooting." "Get her out of here," Deaver spat as the deputies hauled him to his feet. "She's seen enough to hang us all." "That's the idea," Fletcher replied dryly. "Miss Taylor, we may need you to testify at trial, but that won't be for some time. We'll be in touch." After the deputies had taken Deaver away, Yates turned to Margaret, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she replied, though her hands were shaking. "He was really going to shoot you." "Men like that don't take kindly to losing what they consider their property," Yates said grimly. "Let's get out of here. I don't want to be in town if any of his friends are nearby." They rode home at a faster pace than usual, both tense and watchful. Only when they crossed onto Yates's property did Margaret feel her muscles begin to unclench. By unspoken agreement, they went directly to the main house rather than separating. Inside, Yates poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Margaret. "For the nerves," he explained. She took it gratefully, sipping the burning liquid. "He knew you," she said after a moment. "Called you by name. Mentioned a badge." Yates sighed, setting down his empty glass. "I wasn't completely honest about my time with the Rangers," he admitted. "I didn't just leave, I was asked to leave. After what happened to Emily, I became obsessed. Tracked down the men responsible without authorization, without backup. Some died resisting arrest. Others never made it to trial." "You executed them," Margaret said softly, not a question. "Not all," Yates replied, unable to meet her eyes. "But enough that my commanding officer gave me a choice: resign or face charges. I chose to leave Texas altogether, start fresh somewhere no one knew me." He finally looked at her. "I understand if this changes how you see me." Margaret considered his words carefully. The man before her had killed not just in self-defense but in vengeance. And yet he was also the man who had saved her, who read poetry by firelight, who asked permission before kissing her. "Did it bring you peace?" she asked finally. "Taking your revenge?" "No," he admitted. "It just left me hollow, until recently." Until you arrived," Yates said simply. "You reminded me there are things worth protecting, not just avenging. Margaret set down her glass and moved closer to him. I won't pretend to judge what you did, Yates. I don't know what I might have done in your place. She took his hand. But I know who you are now, and that's the man I care for. Relief washed over his features. Even after everything that's happened today, especially after today, she replied firmly. You protected me again, at risk to yourself. Yates pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as if she might break. I was so afraid he would hurt you. I was afraid for you, she confessed against his chest, when he reached for his gun. I'm not that easy to kill, Yates murmured into her hair, and I have too much to live for now. Margaret tilted her face up to his, and this time when they kissed, there was an urgency that hadn't been present before, the desperate relief of two people who had faced mortality and emerged together. When they finally separated, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Not in the cabin, here with me, just to sleep, he added hastily. I don't think either of us should be alone tonight. The propriety Margaret had been raised with Ward briefly with her need for comfort and security. Tonight need one. Yes, she agreed softly, I'll stay. That night, they lay side by side in Yates's bed, not touching except for their intertwined hands between them. The physical closeness was new, but the emotional intimacy had been building since the day he cut the ropes from her wrists. Eventually, exhausted from the day's events, they drifted to sleep, still holding hands like children afraid of being separated in the dark. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains, and the sound of Yates moving quietly around the bedroom, already dressed. Good morning, he said when he noticed she was awake. I was trying not to disturb you. What time is it? She asked, sitting up and smoothing her rumpled clothing. Nearly 8. I've already been out to check the stock. He paused, suddenly awkward. I brought your shawl from the cabin in case you wanted to go back there to change. Margaret appreciated his thoughtfulness. Thank you, and thank you for last night, for understanding. Yates nodded. Coffee's ready in the kitchen when you are. Over breakfast, they discussed the events of the previous day with more clarity than had been possible in the immediate aftermath. The deputies said they knew where the gang was hiding, Margaret recalled. Do you think they'll capture the rest? If Deaver talks, almost certainly, Yates replied. Men like that usually trade information to save their own necks. Will I need to testify at a trial, eventually, he confirmed. But that could be months from now, depending on when they're caught and how busy the circuit judge is. Margaret nodded, absorbing this information. So I have time to decide about Silverton. Yates set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. Margaret, about that. I meant what I said before. You don't have to go. Yates, I know it's too soon, he continued. I know we've only known each other a short time and under unusual circumstances. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. He reached across the table to take her hand. I'm not asking for promises, just time. Stay a while longer, see if what's growing between us might be worth nurturing. Margaret looked into his earnest blue eyes and felt her heart swell. I'd like that, she admitted, to see where this leads, but I need to support myself. I can't just live here indefinitely. The school in Rico has no teacher, Yates suggested. It's small, but they've been looking for someone qualified. You could teach there and continue staying here, or in your cabin if you prefer, he added hastily. You've thought about this, Margaret observed with a small smile. More than I probably should admit, Yates confessed, a rare flush coloring his tanned face. I'll inquire about the position, she promised. It would be a good compromise. The relief on his face was palpable. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she teased. You might grow tired of having me underfoot every day. Never, he said with such conviction that Margaret believed him completely. 2 days later, Yates took Margaret into Rico to inquire about the teaching position. To her delight, the town council was eager to hire her, having been without a schoolteacher for nearly 6 months. The school was small, only 12 students of varying ages, but the salary was adequate, and the proximity to Yates's ranch made it ideal. "They want me to start next Monday," Margaret announced as they left the meeting. "That gives me a week to prepare." "That's wonderful news," Yates replied, his smile genuinely happy. "The children of Rico are fortunate to have you." As they walked down the main street, Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances they received. Word of the shooting incident had spread, as had rumors about her rescue from the auction. She held her head high, refusing to be cowed by gossip. "Miss Taylor," a voice called. They turned to see a woman approaching, a young girl in tow. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. This is my daughter Lucy, who will be in your class." "How lovely to meet you both," Margaret replied warmly, crouching slightly to address the shy child. "Are you excited about school, Lucy?" The girl nodded solemnly. "Will we learn about dinosaur bones? Pa says they find them in the mountains." Margaret laughed. "I'm sure we can include that in our studies." As they continued their conversation, Margaret noticed Yates watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. It wasn't just affection in his eyes, it was admiration, respect, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. The week passed in a flurry of preparation. Margaret worked with Yates to repair and clean the small schoolhouse, which had fallen into disrepair during its vacancy. She planned lessons, organized textbooks, and transformed the neglected building into a welcoming space for learning. On Sunday evening, before her first day of teaching, Yates surprised her with a gift, a beautiful leather satchel for her books and papers. "It's lovely," Margaret exclaimed, running her fingers over the supple leather. "Every teacher needs a proper bag," Yates said, pleased by her reaction. "And this one was made to last." "Like our partnership," Margaret replied without thinking, then blushed at her own boldness. Yates's expression grew serious. "I hope so, Margaret, more than I can say." He kissed her then, a sweet, tender kiss that held promise rather than urgency. When they parted, Margaret felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them, as if they had silently agreed on a shared future, even if neither was ready to speak it aloud. The next morning, Yates insisted on driving her to the schoolhouse for her first day, despite her protests that she could ride herself. "Let me do this," he said as he helped her into the wagon. "I want to see you off properly." At the schoolhouse, several students were already waiting, eyeing their new teacher with curiosity. Yates helped Margaret down from the wagon, then handed her the leather satchel with a flourish that made some of the children giggle. "Good luck today," he said, tipping his hat. "I'll be here at 4 to take you home." "Home," Margaret repeated softly, liking how the word sounded in reference to Yates's ranch. "I'll see you then." As she turned to greet her students, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. 1 month ago, she had been bound and terrified in an auction pen. Today, she was beginning a new career in a community where she was respected, with a man who valued her nearby. Life had taken an unexpected turn, but perhaps it had been for the best after all. The first weeks of teaching passed quickly, with Margaret finding joy in her students' eager minds and the routine of daily lessons. She continued to live in the cabin on Yates's ranch, though she spent most evenings in the main house, sharing meals and conversation with him. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than just the intense circumstances of their meeting. They rode together by firelight, rode the boundaries of the ranch on weekends, and slowly learned each other's histories, dreams, and fears. One Saturday morning in early summer, Margaret was in the garden harvesting vegetables when she heard horses approaching. Looking up, she saw several riders coming down the lane, the deputy marshals, accompanied by the territorial marshal himself. Yates, she called, setting down her basket and hurrying toward the house. He emerged from the barn, saw the approaching lawman, and quickly joined her, standing protectively at her side as the riders dismounted. "Marshal Davis," Yates greeted, shaking the lead man's hand. "What brings you to my ranch?" "Good news, Lawson," Davis replied. "We've rounded up the last of Deaver's gang, caught them trying to rob the Denver-bound stage out of Durango." Margaret gasped. "All of them?" "Every last one," Fletcher confirmed. "Deaver talked like we figured he would. Gave us their hideout location and usual routes. We'll need you to come to Denver for the trial, Miss Taylor," Davis continued. "Probably in about 2 months' time. Your testimony will be crucial, especially regarding your kidnapping." "Of course," Margaret agreed, though the thought of facing her captors again made her stomach tighten. "I'll accompany her," Yates said firmly, his hand finding hers. Davis nodded, his keen eyes noting their clasped hands. "Expected as much. We'll send word when the date is set." He paused. "There's one more thing. The investigation into Sheriff Kelly has progressed. We have enough evidence of corruption to remove him from office, but testimony about the auctions would strengthen our case." Margaret exchanged glances with Yates. "What would I need to do?" she asked. "Just provide a statement about what you witnessed," Fletcher explained. "We're building a case against several men involved in these operations." "I'll do it," Margaret decided, "if it helps ensure no other woman faces what I did." After the lawman left, promising to return with the necessary paperwork, Margaret and Yates sat on the porch swing processing the news. "Are you sure about testifying against Kelly?" Yates asked gently. "It won't be easy having to relive that day." "I'm sure," Margaret replied. "It feels like closing a chapter, ensuring justice is done, not just for me, but for others who might have suffered the same fate." Yates squeezed her hand. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Margaret Taylor," she smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Not brave. Just determined not to let fear dictate my choices anymore." That evening, as they prepared supper together in the comfortable routine they'd established, Yates seemed unusually quiet. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked as she set plates on the table. "No," he replied, then sighed. "Yes. I've been thinking about the trial, about you having to face those men again." "I'll be all right," she assured him, "especially with you there." "That's just it," Yates said, setting down the coffee pot he'd been filling. "I want to be there for you, not just for the trial, but for everything. Every day, every challenge, every joy." He turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Margaret's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "Yates." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Margaret Taylor. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I cut those ropes from your wrists and saw the courage in your eyes. And every day since then has only deepened those feelings." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I thought possible after everything that happened." Yates released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring with a modest diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I had Daniel take it to the jeweler in Durango to be resized." He lowered himself to one knee. "Margaret Taylor, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The tears spilled over now, running unchecked down Margaret's cheeks. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Yates Lawson, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was deep and tender, a promise of all that was to come. "When?" he asked as they finally separated. "How soon can I call you my wife?" Margaret laughed at his eagerness. "After the trial, perhaps. Late summer would be lovely for a wedding." "Too long," Yates grumbled, though his smile belied his complaint. but I suppose it gives us time to plan properly. And for the gossips in Rico to get used to the idea, Margaret added practically. Though I imagine most have already assumed as much. Yates chuckled. Let them talk. We know the truth of how we found each other. That night, Margaret returned to her cabin, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to leave Yates each evening. As she prepared for bed, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman looking back at her was transformed from the terrified creature who had stood trembling in the auction pen months ago. This woman had strength in her eyes, color in her cheeks, and hope in her heart. Mrs. Yates Lawson, she whispered to her reflection, testing the sound of it. The name felt right, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The next 2 months passed in a blur of teaching, wedding preparations, and anticipation of the coming trial. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Rico, met mostly with congratulations, and a few knowing smirks that Margaret chose to ignore. Finally, the summons came for Margaret to appear in Denver for the trial. She and Yates made the journey by train, staying in a respectable hotel near the courthouse. The night before she was to testify, Margaret barely slept, anxious about facing her captors again. You don't have to look at them, Yates reminded her as they walked to the courthouse the next morning. Just focus on the prosecutor and answer his questions. Margaret nodded, grateful for his steady presence. I know, it's just being in the same room with them again. I'll be right there, Yates promised, squeezing her hand. And when it's over, we never have to think about them again. Inside the courtroom, Margaret steeled herself as the defendants were brought in. 5 men, including Miles Deaver, all shackled and looking considerably less threatening than they had during her ordeal. She felt Yates tense beside her as the men were seated, but his expression remained impassive. When called to testify, Margaret spoke clearly and confidently, recounting the stagecoach attack, her captivity, and the auction in Rico. She identified each defendant, explaining their roles in the crimes. Throughout her testimony, she kept her gaze steadfastly on the prosecutor or the judge, refusing to give the defendants the satisfaction of seeing any fear in her eyes. You've shown remarkable courage, Miss Taylor, the judge commented when she had finished. Thank you for your testimony. As she returned to her seat beside Yates, he took her hand and pressed it to his lips, a gesture of pride and support that brought tears to her eyes. The trial lasted 3 days, with multiple witnesses including the deputy marshals and families of other stagecoach victims. In the end, all 5 men were convicted of murder, kidnapping, and robbery, sentenced to hang for their crimes. It's over, Yates said as they left the courthouse for the final time. They can never hurt anyone again. Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice doesn't bring back those who died, but it's something. It's everything the law can provide, Yates replied. The rest is up to us to live well despite what they try to take from us. Their testimony against Sheriff Kelly proved equally effective. Combined with evidence gathered by Marshal Davis, it was enough to remove Kelly from office and ensure he faced charges for corruption and complicity in human trafficking. The new sheriff of Rico, a former Army officer named Patterson, promised to restore integrity to the position. With the trials behind them, Margaret and Yates turned their full attention to their upcoming wedding. They chose a date in August when the mountain wildflowers would be at their peak. The ceremony would be small, held on the ranch with just a few friends from town and Daniel as Yates's best man. Margaret had written to her uncle in Boston, informing him of her plans to marry. His response was predictably disapproving. He had never forgiven her for rejecting the match he had arranged, but Margaret found she cared little for his opinion. She had found happiness on her own terms, with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect Colorado summer day that made the mountains seem to glow with inner light. Margaret dressed in the cabin for the last time, wearing a simple but elegant white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make. Her honey-brown hair was adorned with wildflowers, and around her neck hung a small gold locket Yates had given her as a wedding gift, containing a tiny photograph of the two of them that a traveling photographer had taken in Rico. A knock at the door revealed Daniel, looking uncomfortable in his best clothes but smiling broadly. "Mr. Lawson sent me to escort you to the ceremony, Miss Taylor, though I reckon that's the last time I'll call you that," Margaret laughed, taking his offered arm. "Indeed it is, Daniel. Lead the way." They had set up the ceremony site near the creek that ran through the property, beneath a canopy of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered in the gentle breeze. A small group of guests, teachers from the school, a few rancher friends, and even Deputy Fletcher stood as Margaret approached. But Margaret had eyes only for Yates, who waited beneath an arch of twisted branches and wildflowers with the minister from Rico. He wore a new black suit and had trimmed his hair, but it was the expression on his face as he saw her that took Margaret's breath away, pure love, tinged with disbelief at his own good fortune. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, with vows they had written themselves. When Yates slipped a simple gold band onto Margaret's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady but his voice trembled slightly with emotion. "I take you as my wife, to love and protect, to honor and respect, from this day forward until my last breath," he promised. Margaret's voice was clear as she responded, "I take you as my husband to love and support, to honor and cherish, from this day forward until my last breath. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Lawson, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender and reverent, a sacred seal on their promises. The small gathering of guests applauded as they turned to face them, Yates's arm securely around Margaret's waist. "Mrs. Lawson," he whispered in her ear as they walked back down the makeshift aisle. At last. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, food prepared by the women of Rico, music provided by a fiddler and guitarist from town, dancing on a wooden platform Daniel and Yates had constructed for the occasion. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the valley, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Happy?" Yates asked, finding her alone for a moment as she watched the celebration from the edge of the gathering. "More than I have words for," she replied honestly, leaning into him as his arm circled her shoulders. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that being taken captive would lead to the greatest happiness of my life, I would have thought them mad." "Life has strange ways of bringing people together," Yates agreed, "though I would have preferred to meet you under different circumstances." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "Would we have noticed each other, though? If I had simply arrived in Silverton to teach, and you had come to town on business, I'd have noticed you anywhere," Yates said with conviction. "But perhaps we needed the circumstances. We had to truly see each other not just as man and woman, but as souls who recognized something essential in each other." "My philosophical cowboy," Margaret teased, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Take me home, husband." "With pleasure, wife," he replied, a smile spreading across his face as the words registered in his heart. As they bid farewell to their guests and walked hand in hand toward the main house now truly their home, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror of the auction pen to the safety of Yates's arms, she had traveled a path she never could have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked as they reached the porch steps. "That sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures," Margaret replied. "And that I'm extraordinarily fortunate to have found you, or rather, that you found me." Yates swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold as tradition demanded. "And I'll keep finding you, Margaret Lawson, every day for the rest of our lives." In the years that followed, their love only deepened as they built a life together. Margaret continued teaching Enrico, eventually establishing a proper school building with the help of town donations and Yates's carpentry skills. Yates's horse breeding business flourished, his animals gaining reputation throughout Colorado territory for their quality and training. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed a son they named James, after Yates's father. 3 years later, a daughter joined their family, Emily, named for the aunt she would never know but whose memory lived on in the love her brother had found. The ranch expanded, with additional cabins built for ranch hands and their families. What had once been Yates's solitary refuge became a small community of its own, filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of friendship. Sometimes, when Margaret watched Yates teaching young James to ride or gently rocking Emily to sleep, she would remember the words he had whispered to her in that auction pen so many years ago. "I'm here to take you home." He had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined, creating not just a home of wood and stone, but one of love, respect, and shared dreams. The terrified woman in the auction pen seemed like someone from another lifetime, a shadow dispelled by the light of the life they had built together. And when new settlers or travelers passed through Rico with stories of hardship or loss, the Lawsons were known as people who would offer help without judgment, who understood that second chances were sometimes all that stood between despair and hope. "We give what we were given," Yates would say simply when asked about their generosity. A chance to begin again. For Margaret, that chance had begun with a whisper and a cut rope. For Yates, it had begun with the courage to intervene when others looked away. Together, they had transformed an act of rescue into a lifetime of love, proving that even in the wild uncertainty of the frontier, hearts could find their true home in each other.